Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Muñiz.
The day you have all been waiting for. It's coming up. Sometimes it's scary. Sometimes it's exciting. You don't know whether you want it to come up, but you'll want to get the MCAT over with. Today, we're going to be talking about test day. Now, this is something that often gets overlooked because students spend so much time answering questions, reviewing content, doing flashcards, reviewing full-length exams, which after the last podcast that we touched base on this, you should be spending more time on. But the actual exam, the test day itself, aside from how you actually go about the questions, often gets overlooked. And so today we want to walk you through how tying in what to expect on test day should relate to what you're studying and how you're studying, how to prepare for test day the week of, which is also something that we tend to get questions on whenever there are exams coming up, but also little nuggets on what to do during test day to maximize all of that effort that you have put into getting the score, your goal score, and the score that you want.
Yeah, it's exciting because I feel like there are sometimes things that can go really wrong, and just a little bit of thought ahead of time or a little bit of like being aware of stuff will make it so that these problems don't happen to you guys. Exactly. I've had some students that have had nightmare scenarios and nightmare things kind of pop up. And like things like a marathon on the day of the test, and all of a sudden they can't get to their testing center, right? Because the roads are closed down. And these are things like you want to like be on the lookout for certain things, like foods to eat, like coffee, like what is the test center going to allow you to do? Like how are the actual like procedures of the test center, what you should be doing the week of the test. All of these are things that it's worth it to take some time and talk about these, because even if all those things are taken care of, but they're unexpected, that can create stress for you. Yeah. And which means all of a sudden your like sympathetic system is activated. Maybe you're not thinking as clearly as you should be, because of just unexpected changes and anxiety. So whatever we can do to make this a little bit easier, make this a little bit smoother, is stuff that's worth doing for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. To kind of get us started, we want to start chronologically. So we're going to start way before testing, thinking about how you're studying. And so one of the things that we've talked about when we were going through the study plan, right, the master study plan, Phil, was the order in which students are studying, right? And so one of the things that we talked about is early on, mix it up. Make sure that you maybe do some Chem Phys and a CARS daily passage plus some biochem. Maybe you do psych soc and Chem Phys. And you have a lot of flexibility because you want to allow your mind to develop the flexibility to see connections across sections, right? As you get closer to test day, something that you can do, especially if you start doing timed sections and with CARS specifically, is do them as you expect to see them on test day. So for example, if you're going to do a timed section, try and do it after you've been studying Chem Phys that day, instead of doing it before you start studying Chem Phys that day.
If you're doing a timed CARS section.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Timed CARS section. And so part of the reason for that is I have conversations with students all the time and about this, mostly during the free trial sessions, but also during office hours sometimes, is that students come off of Chem Phys and they're freaking out because they're thinking about, okay, did I miss this question? I know I had to have missed that question. Or they're dwelling on it, or they're like, oh, I don't know how I did, or I just took so long, my timing was off, something like that. They get to CARS and they start panicking because they're still super stressed from Chem Phys. And so one thing that you can do to sort of get into the MCAT test day mindset is 1 week, 2, 3 weeks leading up to that. If you're going to do a timed CARS section, do it after reviewing Chem Phys that day. And that can be helpful to kind of get you accustomed to doing chemistry and physics for a while and then CARS. And that way, if you have that reflex tendency to panic and to panic read, then you start working on it ahead of time. Because like you said, Phil, that sympathetic nervous system activation on test day can really work against you. And so finding ways to balance it out and minimize the impact that it has when you're studying can be super helpful.
Yeah. That's something I don't think I've ever given that advice before, but that makes perfect sense to me. It's like when you are studying, even just like in your regular studying on like a Monday, right? If you're planning on studying cars and biology today, maybe start with cars and then move to bio. Or if you're doing Chem Phys and cars, like do Chem Phys first and then cars, so that you're doing things and kind of like switching from one gear to the next, and it'll normalize that for you. And that's really what a lot of this that we're going to talk about in this little like area, this little segment here, is about just normalizing test day. You need to make sure that when you show up to test day, it just feels like a regular, normal practice test for you. So there's other things that kind of go into this, like you should do your practice tests at the same time of day that you're taking your actual test. You should develop a routine. Like, what sort of things do you eat for breakfast? Eat the same thing. I also really encourage students to not take their practice tests like at home, like on their couch or like in their bed on their laptop, because you want to make sure to normalize the experience. And so going to like the library, right? And like sitting at the library with people around you, at like, and just kind of like getting up, getting out, like traveling in the morning, like eating breakfast, like taking the breaks, doing everything just like you would on test day, so that on the day of your actual test, it doesn't seem as weird and scary and as anxiety inducing, because this is just, it's pretty much the exact same thing, except for they want to look at my ID before I go in. Other than that, it's pretty much the exact same of what I've been doing every weekend for the last several months. And that makes it a lot easier to go into that.
Yeah. And this is something else that can be helpful. If you have the ability to do it, test in different places. So I once had a student come back to me and say, yeah, I had only been studying at the library, and when test day came along, I was stressed because I had only ever done it at the library. And so, for example, if you can, depending on where you live, on roommates, et cetera, if you can do it, for example, at the kitchen table, right? One exam, and then the library at another. Part of what can make the library really helpful in preparing you for test day is that people are on their laptops. Right. And so if it's if it's a place where people are constantly talking, that's probably not the best library. Maybe, so if you're in school somewhere else on campus might be helpful. But when people are clicking, when people are typing, that can be helpful, because on test day, the Pearson test centers are not just MCAT students when you go to test. It is people taking all sorts of different exams. And so you want to make sure, so that means some people are going to be like just clicking on the mouse, and people in general, if they're highlighting, they're clicking on the mouse. So being able to block that noise out is going to be helpful. Even if, for example, you have, foam earplugs or headphones, sometimes that still comes through, and you don't want that to be a distraction on test day.
And there's people coming and going because the exams all start at different times. And while it isn't like a really chatty place, like the proctor may come in and talk to the person like next to you, being like, okay, like time to start the exam, or like maybe they raise their hand and they like want to use a bathroom break or something, and so the proctor may come in and talk to them quietly. And so learning to tune out like other people around, that's why it's good. Don't do it just like all in the same area. And I like the idea of mixing it up. I think like a Starbucks might be too far in the chaos area, but like if you have quiet areas in your dorms, or quiet areas in like your like at your university, like places around there, or like maybe a quiet area in a hospital. If there's something there, I think that actually could be kind of useful as well. Libraries, but just kind of make it so that on the day of your actual test, it just feels like another regular day. And whatever you can do to do that, you should. This also, sorry, go ahead.
So I know we said like no couches, no beds. Some libraries have like really comfy, couch-like chairs. Don't use them. So it's all these little things that we don't realize that go into it. But I wanted to say that because the library near me has one of those, and that's my favorite place to like generally study. Yeah.
There's also just kind of training your body to be effective at the same time that you're taking the test. This also goes to like studying. like try to study at the same time of day that your actual test is. Try to take all of your practice tests at the exact same time of day. This is less problematic now, but during COVID, like there were some exams in the afternoon, and like that messed with students who were used to like taking all their practice tests in the morning, and now all of a sudden they're taking their practice test at 3:00 and ending at like 11:00 or midnight. And that really threw off a lot of students. So whatever your test day scenarios are going to be, mimic that. If you have accommodations and your test is spread over 2 days, spread your practice tests over 2 days. Like do everything exactly the way that you're going to. And I know that we've said this, I feel like pretty much every episode for the last couple of episodes, but if you plan on getting accommodations, get accommodations early. It takes a while. And like, it's a lot harder to get than I think students realize. And sometimes it may take a couple of attempts. And so don't take all your practice tests with accommodations, banking on the fact that you think you're going to get accommodations on test day. Because if all of a sudden you don't get that and you have to show up and take the exam, not just without the accommodations, but now also different than every other practice test you've ever taken, that's a recipe for disaster. So you should be working on getting accommodations on day one of your prep, like months before you actually take a practice test. You should be working on getting your accommodations.
Yeah. Something else that I don't think we've mentioned is, if possible, try and take it the same day of the week. So as your actual exam is going to be. I know that some of what we've talked about is not feasible early on, right? So early on, if, for example, you're in school, you may not be able to start studying at the same time and block off, right, an entire day for studying the way you would perhaps later on as you get closer to test day. So we recognize that some of this will not be day one, and that is okay. But definitely as you get closer to test day, you want to try and make these switches as much as possible. And with that comes when you wake up. So this is a tough one because many of us we do not naturally wake up very early in the day. We have to tell ourselves and put alarms to wake up very early in the day. And so if you can get yourself on a test day sleep schedule, starting a month out, you will be golden by the time test day comes around. I've had students, sometimes they're testing in less than a week and they're like, oh yeah, I have to get used to it. And I'm like, what? No, now is not, you should have been doing this, right? Because you don't want to try and change your sleep schedule, 3 days before your exam. That's not going to be great, especially because now it's just another factor, right? And what if you wake up feeling groggy for the next couple of days or something like that? You want to make sure that as much as possible, you set your sleep schedule in a way that is conducive to test day. And I think I said this the last time we talked about it, but don't assume that you need X number of hours without finding out if that's actually what you need. So don't say, oh, everybody says we need 8 hours of sleep, so I'm going to try and sleep 8 hours. That might wake you up at a point in time where you're not getting that full cycle of sleep. And so one thing that you can do is, on a day where it doesn't matter when you wake up or what time you wake up, go to sleep and then see how many hours you need to wake up feeling rested. Right. And that's a sweet spot for you. So for some people that might be 7 hours, for some people that might be 9 hours, and just find that sweet spot and then work backwards. So say, okay, I need to wake up at 6 a.m. on test day. What is the absolute latest that I can go to bed? Right. And that gives you that ability to stay rested. And when you're studying, which we've talked about, it's super important. It's also going to improve your memory. It's going to help you retain the information that you're studying and be more effective in reviewing your full-length exams. I had to. It was right there, Phil.
Let's tie to the previous episode.
Exactly.
This is also like not just the night before the exam, make sure you're getting enough sleep. And like, I know you're saying this, but like the whole week leading up to it.
Yes.
Like make sure that you are getting enough sleep. Ideally, you're doing that for the months leading up to your exam, but especially that week of the test, you need to make sure that you are in tip-top form. There are a lot of students that, as their test day approaches, that their studying and effort ramps up in direct correlation with how close the test day is. You want to make sure that your last week before the test should be your easiest one, right? This is not the time to sit down and start studying kidneys and magnetism for the very first time. This is not, and I know, Azaii, this is gonna like cause a reaction with you. This is not a time to change your strategies for dealing with things. I know that you see this sometimes, and it is like, no, like the week before your test, that should be your easiest week. So much of the exam is critical thinking, right? Is like figuring out all of cars is critical thinking. There's no knowledge you need to have going into that section other than like strategies. You got to have strategies. It's skill based. It's not knowledge based. And then in the sciences, it's also like a lot of critical thinking, like interpreting graphs and making connections and doing math. If you are tired and exhausted, critical thinking is harder. If you are burnt out, critical thinking is harder. Like imagine that like I woke you up in the middle of the night and asked like, oh, name an amino acid, right? Like most students would be okay with that. But if I'm like wake them up in the middle of the night, okay, they wouldn't be okay with me waking them up in the middle of the night. They would be okay answering that question, but then they would have other questions coming after that for me. But if I woke you up in the middle of the night and said, hey, read this journal article and explain it to me, right? Like that is way harder to do when you're like groggy and sleepy and just kind of out of it. And you want to make sure that on the day of your actual test, that you are thinking as clearly as you possibly can. And I promise you that will have a bigger effect than staying up late and studying electrostatics and magnetism and light and sound and changing up your car strategies. Like doing all of those things in the days before your test is going to hurt you because you will not be thinking critically. You will not have practice skills. You want to make sure that the week of your test you are taking, that should be the easiest week of your prep. I use this analogy all the time, but the MCAT is a marathon, right? If you are running a marathon, 2 days before the marathon is not the day that you get in shape for running marathons. That's something you are working on months before that. That 2 days before the marathon, like you're not doing anything, right? Like you're like doing your lightest training days should be those days. So I don't want to tell students to do nothing the week of their test because you won't listen to me if I tell you to do that. And I do think it's not a bad idea to do some stuff, but don't do the things that are going to exhaust you. Don't do practice exams. Don't do tons of really hard data interpretation. You should be doing things like reviewing vocab in psych, reviewing units, right? Like reviewing equations, like looking at some flashcard stuff. That stuff is not as mentally draining as doing exams and doing passages with complex data or doing like giant timed sections. Those are the things that you should be doing in the like weeks and months leading up to that week of the test. The week of the test should be your easiest week. And that's really, really important.
Yeah. I also, this is very related to what you just talked about. And I want to make sure that we explicitly say it for students. So if you're not sleeping, right? Yes, it's going to affect your critical thinking. What sections are going to be most affected? Absolutely cars, biochem. I don't think students realize how much biochem is application and critical thinking. What section is going to be least affected? Probably psych-soc. What section do students tend to do better on? Psych-soc. So you're taking the sections that students tend to have more difficulty with, and you're making it harder for you to to be able to do critical reasoning. So your score has the potential to go down a lot more in your practice exams if you're not sleeping enough. So you're taking those areas that might already be weaker areas and then giving yourself a disadvantage in those specific areas.
I see that often in students that are pushing really hard. Like all of a sudden they're burnt out and like their cars and bio scores drop the most. Chem Phys is kind of resilient because it's at the very beginning. And so you're not like the burnout and tiredness doesn't affect you as much at the beginning, but like you're 5 hours in and you're reading a really complex bio passage. It is hard if you are exhausted and burnt out and just not in the zone.
Exactly. So that's something else that I wanted to explicitly say. I want to say this because I don't think I explicitly said this either with respect to sound. So when you're studying, trying to mimic that ambient noise that you may or may not get on test day, but note that you will be offered noise canceling devices. So either over the ear headphones. I believe foam earplugs, I know they used to do that. When I recently went to a Pearson test center for a different exam, no, I retook the MCAT. No. When I went for a different exam, they told us that we could bring our own earphones, earplugs. I don't know why it's so hard to find those words. And they didn't offer me any, so I had them. If you're studying with them, just bring those and leave them in your bag. Ask on test day. It may be that that particular site, says, no, we have our own to offer you, or they're like, yeah, you can use those. So that's something to take with you on test day if that's how you've been studying. I know most people are no longer wearing masks. If you plan on wearing a mask on test day, take your practice exams with the masks. You do not want that to be a source of difficulty on test day. I just wanted to say that. I didn't want us to forget that.
That's not the day you want to figure out that the mask fogs up my glasses and I can't see. And that's why it's so important to practice on all of your practice tests like you're going to do it on your actual test day.
Fun fact for anyone with glasses, if you take a little bit of soap, put it on your glasses, and then don't rinse your glasses. Wipe the soap, so cover the lens and wipe the soap off. It helps a lot. It helps a ton with foggy glasses. Yeah.
I've also heard people using Rain-X, which is the stuff you put on windshields to make it so the water droplets don't stick to it. And you can also, I've seen people do that with glasses to stop them from fogging as well.
I can see that working.
Yeah. One more thing on this mask thing. I'm not going to go in and tell you whether or not you should wear a mask on test day, but you want to be really careful not to get sick the week of your actual exam. Especially if you're taking the test, in January. There's a lot of students that take the test in January and they went home over Christmas and they all get sick. And then all of a sudden they're fighting illness on the day of their actual test, which is not what you want to be doing. Or if you're taking it in May and your finals are around there, and finals on top of MCAT generally stresses people out. You release a lot of cortisol, you get immunosuppressed, and you get sick. I always got sick during finals. And so just being aware of trying to be extra careful. Yeah, don't go to concerts and make out with strangers the week of your test. Do that the week after your test. But these are things to just be a little bit more aware of, be a little bit more careful, because you don't want to find yourself in a situation that messes with your test day that you could have avoided. And so especially those last couple of weeks, I generally encourage students try to be a little bit more careful, just because an illness at the wrong time could really mess you up. And you don't want to be in a scenario where I didn't get into med school because I went to a concert and then I got sick on the day of my MCAT. So my MCAT score dropped 5 points. And so then I didn't get in, right?
Maybe not.
Yeah. Try to avoid those scenarios. I know Taylor Swift is awesome. But maybe try to figure that out, or at least take precautions if you do those things.
Exactly. So how do you plan for the actual day of the exam? So we've talked about, what you should do leading up to the exam. You want to start thinking, okay, what will exam day itself look like? Something that maybe it's because I like food. Maybe it's because I'm someone that I like to pack snacks. And on test day, I had a bajillion snacks. Or maybe it's because I know that some people, when they get stressed, they don't eat. They have a tendency to forget to eat. You want to make sure that you actually think about what you're going to have with you on test day. So in terms of drinks, in terms of food, because that's what you're going to be consuming during your break. And you're going to be doing a whole lot of thinking. So you do not want to crash because of what you ate on test day. You do not want to be exhausted all of a sudden because you just ate a really big meal on test day. And so you want to make sure, yes, that you have some carbs, but you also have some protein, right? Some longer lasting, slower release, foods in your system. And you want to actually prep that in advance. So if you can start studying and taking your full length exams with those meals, again, that's just taking out unknown variables or changes on test day. That can be helpful for some students. Now I recognize Not everyone is going to want to do that, and that is okay. But again, the whole idea of what we're talking about here is to minimize things that could cause any kind of distress on test day, or that would have another variable thrown into the mix. And so you want to make sure that you're having that.
Yeah. This is something I've occasionally had, like a student who's like, parents wanted to cook them like a really special breakfast for the day of the test. Yeah. And like, don't do something that you don't do on your practice test. Like if your parents are like that, or whoever, be like, let's do that after the test. Let's go out to eat and do something like crazy and awesome, and like go to my favorite like Italian place. But I'm going to have the same thing for breakfast that I have for all of my practice tests, because I want to like fall into the routine. Oh no, Azaii just drank water down the wrong hole. She's currently expiring. Another thing kind of related to this, I'm just going to keep going. So just don't die. Okay. Another thing about kind of like the food that you eat. So my neuro background is coming in here a little bit, but neurons are picky. Neurons don't work well on like fat metabolism and things like that. Neurons pretty much run on glucose, which is why like under certain conditions in your body, under starvation, like your muscles and stuff don't burn glucose, and your liver and kidney are creating glucose and dumping that into your blood system for your brain, because your brain likes glucose. And so this is why if you are if you're low blood sugar, right, or hangry, right, like it doesn't really affect your muscles as much, but affects your neurons, right? So like if you're low blood sugar, you have kind of a harder time thinking, but like you can still run and kick and lift heavy objects. And so this is why I really recommend students for the day of their test, that routine, try to have something in the morning that's going to release like carbs over time. Things like oatmeal, right, is good. Like Cliff Bars and things like that. There are a lot of times that students will take a practice test, and this is why the routine is so important, that the first time they take a practice test, they're like, oh, I don't normally eat breakfast in the morning, but I was starving halfway through the cars section, because thinking does burn calories. It's like exercising, like it can make you really hungry. And so making sure that you are just ready for whatever's happening on the day of your test. I really recommend like oatmeal stuff. Maybe like I did a peanut butter and jelly sandwich because I'm secretly 5 years old. And I love peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. But I know another factor in this is also caffeine, and that plays a role in this as well.
So still recovering from choking on water. That's what I get for staying hydrated. But you mentioned the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. For my exam, that's what I did. Mm-hmm. Except instead of, this is going to be a hot take, don't knock it till you try it. But peanut butter with ham, oh my gosh, it's actually really good.
That's a little weird.
It's so good though. Anyway,
I'll try it.
Give it a try. Come back and let me know. Send me a message afterwards after you get a chance to try it. But for me, that was because it wasn't something that needed to be heated. It was something that had some protein, had some fats, and had a little bit faster, right, carb release. Because I'd already had a good setup. And during this particular exam, it was 7 blocks, so we had smaller breaks in between, so I knew that I could go get a snack if I needed one. Caffeine, though, oh my goodness, if you do not normally drink coffee, do not plan on starting to pick up drinking coffee even the week of your exam. It is not a good idea. You don't want to throw another wrench into how your body, is going to react. If you normally drink caffeine, this is not the time to try and quit drinking caffeine, because you do not want withdrawal symptoms on test day. This also goes for medications. If you normally take medications on a regular basis, this is not the time to play with changing when you take them or anything like that. Medications, right, if you change when you take them, can also have withdrawal symptoms. And then be mindful of how much caffeine you drink on test day, because caffeine is a diuretic. So it may send you to the bathroom. Be mindful of that, because the last thing you want to do is have to sit through a section having to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, that's a big thing. And like on that topic of medications, I also actually really encourage students to take an NSAID, right? Like a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, like Tylenol or ibuprofen or Aleve, right? Advil. Take one of those the morning of your practice test, because it will, like a lot of times the chairs are not comfortable, the screens are bad, and so as a result you kind of can't, like, you get a headache partway through the exam. I encourage students to take one of those as just like a preventative measure. Once again, all of this stuff that we're talking about, do it all on your practice tests as well. I am a caffeine addict. I am a caffeine fiend, and I have just written it off like, okay, I'm going to be addicted to caffeine, and that's just a part of who I am, and I'm okay with it. But as a result of that, like, I knew that I was going to need caffeine on the day of the test, but like, I didn't want to have like a lukewarm coffee that had been sitting in my locker for several hours with milk in it. I'm like, that seems a little weird because that's how I like my coffee, but like, I don't want to leave that in my locker because that might be bad idea to drink like milk that had been sitting out for a while halfway through my test. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to do black tea, and I'm going to make it really strong with a lot of caffeine. And I'm just going to like put that in my locker, and I'll have some iced tea over my breaks. And so whatever you do, you want to make sure that you are practicing that going into those things.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to keep all of this in mind while you're studying and while you're doing your prep that week too. Because, for example, let's say that, your last practice test was a week out, which it should be a week out from your test day. This also gives you an opportunity the week of your exam to continue reinforcing what you're going to be working on. I also took, in my case, I took an Aleve the morning of my exam, because I have a propensity towards headaches, towards migraines. For anyone who has, who wears glasses, gets eye fatigue, wears contacts, this can be especially helpful. I would also say have an extra one in your bag just in case. Because let's say you do get a headache, you want to make sure that you have something to terminate that headache. Same thing also with folks with migraines. Make sure that you have the abortive medication that you've been prescribed, if it's at the level of prescription, with you on test day. The last thing you want to do is forget these really important things on test day, which goes to having everything ready as much as possible the night before your exam. So this means, yes, the medications, right, that we've talked about, have that Tylenol, have that Aleve, have that ibuprofen already out the night before your exam. Have your ID, your unexpired, I don't know, either way. Unexpired government issued ID out. Double check the expiration date. So on my test day, I always say this story, and I'm still in shock. There was a student who came and their ID was expired. So then they went home, came back with the passport. The passport was expired. Guess what? They didn't test that day. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine the stress of that? You want to get it over with, and then your stuff isn't you can't use it. So you want to make sure that you check that you have it out. You do not want to show up on test day and not have to go back home, have to come back, because that's an additional stressor, right? So even if you do get to test, now you're under a lot more stress, and it's going to be tougher for you to focus, right? Yeah. And you might be kicking yourself like, oh, why didn't I do this? And then you're frustrated with yourself. So that's not a good situation either.
Yeah. Other things that are kind of in that vein of just like last minute stuff to make sure that you have handled, like ID and those sorts of things. Also, definitely in that vein, I'm going to put make sure you know how to get to your test center. Make sure you've got the route planned. I know I already hinted at this at the very beginning, but I once had a student who could not get to their test center on time because there was a marathon planned all of a sudden for that Saturday that they were taking their test. So maybe check real quick, Google your the town you're in or taking the test in, and then traffic on that day. And because obviously the marathon had been planned and they had posted, that these roads are going to be closed on this day. And so just look for those things. You're going to be really annoyed with your local politicians if there's a politician, like a president comes into town and all of a sudden the roads are closed, you can't get to your test. So factor those things in. Another thing that goes into that as well is sometimes students, due to scheduling issues, are taking the test in a city that is not where they live. I have had students before that were really dead set they needed this test day, and the only opportunity was for them to fly to Arkansas and take the test in Little Rock. And that's actually strangely happened a couple of times. I've had students have to fly to Little Rock to take a practice test. And you want to make sure, in that scenario, I actually encourage you, if you are taking your test on Saturday, don't fly in on late Friday night. If anything, fly in early Friday or on Thursday, and make sure that you are comfortable with the town, that if you're renting a car, you know how to get to the places you're going. If you're planning on taking public transit, make that journey, right? Do that journey at least once so that you know exactly how you're getting there. If you are if you're planning on taking Uber for the first time in your life, make sure that you have that the Uber app is working and valid and your credit card information works and all of those things. I know that this sounds really silly, but we have both had students who have run into these issues. And it is something that is avoidable. And so if you can plan for this, make sure you know how to get to your test center, what you can take with you. Definitely read the AAMC's guidelines that they post about what stuff you can take and what stuff you can leave in your locker. As a matter of fact, we may leave that link in the blurb for this podcast, so you can go in and check that stuff out. But that's a really important thing.
Yeah, this applies more to folks in urban areas, but sometimes there are cities that have, for example, a west, 31st Street and an east 31st Street, or
31st Terrace versus Street versus Drive.
Or, I think Boston has some streets that are in the same general area that sometimes, will be written as Boston versus not. Make sure that you put it into a map and double check that there's a test site there. So that way you know that you have the correct test site. I remember,
better yet, make that journey and make sure the test site is there and everything's good.
Yeah. And then something else that you can do is write down the address, copy the address on a physical sheet of paper that you have with you on test day. The reason I say this is that it's really unfortunate, but in Chicago, at least when I tested, there was a site at the same location, but east and west of the same street. And so you do not want to end up in a situation where you end up in the wrong one because you put in, instead of, on the Uber, on your GPS, you put in X test center, and then, you went by the test center name instead of the actual address. So something very small, but has the potential to have a very large impact if not addressed ahead of time. So when you're getting close to testing, plan accordingly. Make sure that you have all of these details ironed out. You do not want any snafus on test day.
Yeah. So we've talked about the stuff leading up to your test. You've talked about the week before your test. We've talked about getting to the test center and all the things there. Let's talk about your actual test. You sit down, you have a tutorial. Now that tutorial time is yours, and it is good for collecting your thoughts. To be honest, if you're taking practice tests and using the AMC ones, you don't necessarily need to go through the tutorial because it's the same as always. And so go through that. Sometimes students will use that tutorial time to write down a quick thing in their little notebook that they have with them. I don't want to encourage students to sit down and just start sketching out and doing lots of work and writing stuff. That's not really what I would advocate that time for. If you have a quick mnemonic you want to write down, I think that's okay, and generally is allowed for test days, although check with your test center.
Yes.
Now, beyond that, that first passage, we've talked about that. We talked about that a little bit last week. But sometimes students have a hard time kind of getting into the rhythm. And so just from your practice test, you should know, does the first passage take me longer than it should? Or do I get like really nervous and jump in and like do the first passage way too quick because my timing is off? But this kind of once again goes to that prep time going in there. But make sure that you are kind of like getting into the rhythm on this. And we have a ton of podcast episodes on timing and schedules and reviewing and all of these things. We kind of talk about this a little bit, but to just help you kind of get into that flow and make sure you know what you're doing when you're starting that test.
Yeah, I want to talk to some of my cars worried folks. So with cars, this is, to all car students, honestly, in the course, outside of the course, free trial, it's a conversation I have pretty frequently. But oftentimes students will come in and start panic reading. They come to that first passage and they know that they struggle with cars and they know it's just strategy. And so they just go at it. They might spend even longer than they should because they didn't slow down and start slowly. So what can often happen is you rush through those first few paragraphs, realize you have no idea what's going on in the passage, then slow down so much that you start, worrying about things you don't need to worry about. You get to the questions, you're overthinking. So starting slower than you think you need to for cars, if you have that tendency to reflex panic, is going to be more fruitful and will actually save you time in the long run, because then you're not overcorrecting in the latter half of your approach to that passage. Like Phil said, though, earlier, like you said earlier, that doesn't mean that you spend 14 minutes on the first science passage. That's not good use of your time, right? But it means you can, if you have that tendency to overcorrect, recognize it, and then kind of gauge how much time a passage should take you before you're doing practice exams. Something that I actually like to tell students, if you are like me and are going into this with no concept of the passage of time, what can be helpful is when you're doing questions, have a 1-minute timer goal. This is not, let me be very clear, this is not anywhere near test day. This should have been done a long time ago, but it just came to mind. And that can help you get a sense of what a minute feels like when it's passing. And okay, am I spending an appropriate amount of time on this question, or have I only just read the question and I haven't even started thinking about the answer choices, and that minute timer goes off. So if you're like me and have no concept of time, that can be helpful in the earlier prep phase.
Yeah. I was just going to say, a lot of this that we're talking about, like, adjusting your timing and things like this, all of this ideally should be done in that prep phase before this. And this is why we want you to like change up where you're taking the test. We want you to kind of like do things a little bit different and develop this routine so that when you actually show up, it just feels like a routine. There are a lot of students who don't do that, who like take all their tests in their bed at home and they always eat different things, or they skip breakfast all these days, but they have breakfast the day of the actual test. And then they like go to the center and they're kind of panicking. And as a result of this just all being unfamiliar and this anxiety kind of makes students like jump in too fast or too slow, or it kind of messes with students. And this is why we want you to get into the routine of like, this is just another day. I've done this so many times and it has become routine.
Yeah. Also with the tutorial time for cars worried folks, this is a great time to recap your strategies. It's nothing that you have to write down, right? But in your head, exactly. Use that extra time. If like Phil, like you were saying, that you have a tendency to choose out of scope answer choices for this one particular question type, this is a perfect time to remind yourself, right? And you can do something similar in between passages if you start getting concerned. Take 5 seconds, close your eyes, take a deep breath, right? Because that's something that I also hear students when they have trouble with time. They're like, why would I stop between passages to take a deep breath? If you are super stressed in that moment, you're going to do worse, right? If you're still dwelling on that last passage, you're going to do worse. So taking 5 seconds for cars, right? You would take 5 seconds 8 times because you have those 9 passages, right? 8 times 5, 40 seconds, less than a minute, right? Yeah. That has the potential to improve your score for less than a minute investment, right? So just practice taking those moments in between passages, and that can be super powerful. And I think I've said this before, and if I haven't, I'm saying it now, look away from your screen every so often. If you have a tendency for your eyes to get fatigued, if you wear glasses, contacts, etc., looking at a brightly lit screen for 90 minutes nonstop can have an effect. right? You do not want to go to that next section with your eyes exhausted, strained, developing a headache. So every couple of passages, just take a moment and look away from the screen. This does not mean turn around and look at something random, because that could get you in trouble, right? That could
don't walk around the room and
yeah, that could mean the proctor comes over and you have to have a conversation, but just look away from the screen and focus on something else. And that can also be helpful to just kind of reset.
I would say when talking about looking away from the screen, I mean, like a part of that could also be just defocusing your eyes and looking like as if it's into the distance, right? Kind of like that thing that people do when they space out. They're not actually looking at what's in front of them. They're just kind of like changing the focal length of the lens in the eye, and like that actually relaxes it a little bit. So kind of like look through the screen, if that makes sense. This is something I also encourage students to do during the sciences. And that's something I did. Is I didn't do it after every passage, but I did every other passage, every 2 passages. I would just take a deep breath, hold it, kind of like look into the distance and like close my eyes and kind of like stretch my neck for a second and then dive back in. This is something that I actually think is pretty useful, because if you were just in the zone nonstop for 8 hours, like your neck is going to get sore, like you're going to be kind of stressed out. And so just taking a second and just being like, all right, let's move to the next one. And then just kind of like working through that. Even if it's just a couple of seconds, like just taking a moment and kind of spacing it out there, like a mini break. I'm not saying take like 5 minutes, but just 5 seconds, right? To just kind of like hold your breath for a second. I always would hold my breath and think about how, because of holding my breath, the carbon dioxide is increasing in my body, makes my blood more acidic, which mimics exercise, because your blood gets acidic when you exercise. So I'm just like, it's almost like doing some crunches, just holding my breath. Okay, let's go back in.
Phil, that is so you.
Yeah. That's something I think about a lot. Just side note, that's why meditation often makes people feel like they've exercised, because when you meditate, you kind of do deep breathing and it acidifies your blood. And so like at the end of meditation, you kind of feel like you've exercised. Like in terms of physical activity, like meditation or deep breathing is not any different from sitting on the couch and watching Netflix, but we feel a little bit different afterwards. And I think just taking a moment and like slowing your breathing, your blood gets a little more acidic, like it kind of feels better after a moment of that. So just kind of like take a second, take a deep breath and hold it, and then dive back in after every passage or every couple of passages.
Yeah, this is not something we were planning on talking about, but you and I were talking about it earlier. So sitting for that long can take its toll, right? So stretch. Take your breaks as an opportunity to stretch, because you are going back to sitting the entire time. I say this as someone who is currently working on releasing some overworked muscles, but the hip flexors, right? The ones that bring your hips up, the ones that help you with walking, the ones that are engaged when you are sitting, can get very tight, can worsen, back problems, can cause just general discomfort. And so you don't want to end up in that situation on test day. So actually working on stretching, even leading up to test day, can help you be as physically relaxed as possible on test day, and then use those breaks, right? Like you were saying, with even during the exam, just kind of stretching your neck, etc. But your actual breaks are an opportunity for that. And actually, that segues us to our breaks.
The breaks,
Take them. Take your breaks. Now is not the time to power through because your adrenaline is rushing. That can be an easy thing to do, in the sense of you're like, okay, I have the energy. Let me just go. I want to get this over with. You need that rest. Your brain needs that rest. And so take those breaks, but leave time to come back in, because yes, everyone is taking their exams at a different point in time, right? And so not everybody's coming back in at the same time. But you have to get, depending on the site and how strictly they're sticking to the rules, you might have to get your hands scanned. You're going to have to take off your glasses. They might scan you, right, with the metal detector. You're going to have to flip your pockets inside out. If you're wearing boots like I did, I was wearing snow boots on test day. I had to put my hands in my boots and show that I didn't have anything in my boots. So it takes a little bit. And so I would say maybe like 2 minutes to actually get back in. And if the timer hasn't started, then that's a great opportunity when you're sitting, right, to take another deep breath, recap the strategies. If you're getting ready to sit for cars or for biochem, just do like a quick recap. But be mindful, take your breaks, but be mindful in terms of coming back in.
Yeah. You don't want to be in a situation where you take your break and you come back and the exam started without you and like the clock started going, and like that's not a scenario you want to be in. However, like I don't want students to be so worried about that they don't take a break. It is absolutely critical. Take a break. Get a little bit of exercise, get the blood flowing a little bit. During the breaks, I actually went out into the hallway and did push-ups because I'm like, I just want to get the blood flowing a little bit. Walk to the bathroom, even if you don't have to go to the bathroom, right? Like I spent like 7 minutes of my like 10-minute thing, just kind of like I would grab my iced tea, I would like drink my iced tea and walk around, go to the bathroom, do some quick push-ups, put my iced tea away, and then go back into the room going into that. So do take your breaks. Like that is a non-negotiable for me. Like that's something students have to do this if they want to do well.
Yeah, this was not a problem on my MCAT test day. It became a thing on my most recent test at my most recent test site. Find out where the bathroom is before you need it. Mm-hmm. So before you sit down for your exam, find out where it is. On my test day, most recently, my exam, I had to leave the site. I had to walk around. It was associated with some medical offices in that same building. And I had to walk down a pretty long hall to get to the bathroom. So you want to have that in mind. You don't want to end up in a situation where you have a snack, you've been taking your time, and like, I'm going to make a quick run to the bathroom, and all of a sudden it's on the other side of, the floor, right? Mm-hmm. So find out where it is ahead of time. That will be helpful if you end up in that scenario. On my test day for MCAT, though, it was right outside. It was right around the corner. So just kind of keep that in mind because you don't know the layout of the test center before you get there.
Yeah. And I know we've talked about this actually already, but like cars and biochem tend to be the most reasoning or critical thinking heavy sections. Note that those two sections are separated by your lunch break.
Yes. Take
the lunch break. Like take a moment to just kind of decompress, eat, even if you are not hungry. Mm-hmm. Eat some stuff. I know we've talked about like peanut butter and jelly, but like make sure that you're eating something, like I said, kind of complex carbs, right? Like maybe some nuts, maybe Cliff Bars. I did a peanut butter and jelly and a Cliff Bar, and I think I had like a bag of chips, and like that was my lunch, and I was very happy with it, along with my iced tea. You might also, I know some people like to drink Gatorade in there as well because it's got a little bit of sugars going. And so just kind of make sure that you're taking that break and like you are in your tip-top form. And that really is the big takeaway from everything that we've been talking about. The day of your test, you should be in the zone. Everything should be thought about and prepped for, and there's no big curveballs coming. It's a routine that you have prepped for. You've done the hardest part if you've gotten to this point. Like the hardest part of the MCAT is not taking the MCAT. Taking the MCAT is the easiest part of the MCAT. The hardest part of the MCAT is prepping for the MCAT. And so if you've gone through all of this work, all of this effort, all of this journey, and you're at the very end where it's just take the test, right? That is the easiest part of this journey. And like just getting to that point in and of itself is something that you should be proud of. And you should like go into this knowing that like I'm in a situation that this is the best part of this entire process. Putting the MCAT, like finishing that and then putting it into your rear view mirror is a really awesome feeling. It's one of the weirdest feelings that I've had in my life. I still remember like finishing my MCAT and just being like, what do I do with my life now? Right? I've got so much free time all of a sudden. I need a hobby. I actually bought a musical instrument the day after my MCAT because I woke up in the morning and I'm like, I've got all day to do whatever I want. I need a hobby, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm going to learn to play the banjo. And I actually do play the banjo because of just that weird feeling of like, I've got so much time. What do I do with myself? And so that's something also to keep in mind. I don't want students to stress out so much about the actual MCAT. Ideally, in a perfect world, you should be prepped for the exam going in there. You should not be going in there saying, I hope I do better than all of my practice tests, and like maybe by some lucky chance I'm going to do well because I'm going to be good at guessing. You should walk into the test knowing this is the last time I'm going to have to take an MCAT. And after that, I'm going to move past that. If that's not the scenario you're in, you maybe need to adjust your plan. I want to take a moment to just emphasize we have academic advisors who are there to talk with you and make a game plan and figure out how to make sure that you're ready on the day of your test. We have our courses. If you guys are in our courses, we spend a lot of time and really want to emphasize, like, we want to get you prepped for this exam. We want you to go into that test knowing I'm going to do well and I'm going to take care of this test and I'm going to knock it out. And that's really the feeling that you want to have, is just that confidence of knowing I have done everything I need to do. And now I just got to do one more thing and then I'm done. And it's an awesome feeling when you actually get to that point. And you want to make sure that you are ready on the day of your actual test.
Yeah. Here at Jack Westin, we want to make sure that after you have met with us, after you've encountered us, you don't have to take the exam again. Right. And so if, let's say that you already took it and you're a retest taker, that is okay. We don't want you to have to retake again. Right. So this applies to everyone who comes our way. This means we're going to say it again, do not change your strategy on test day. And if you are feeling the need to change your strategy a week out before your exam, meet with an academic advisor. You probably need to push your exam day back. And we would rather
or assess, or maybe you're fine and you are worried unnecessarily.
Yeah.
Which sometimes happens.
Yes. The reason I say that is sometimes we have people come in, at least again, with respect to cars, and they want to change their strategy because they're not doing well.
Yeah,
right?
That does happen.
Exactly. So you want to make sure that you are meeting with someone, even if, exactly like you were saying, Phil, the outcome ends up being, oh, I was just, really stressed. I was concerned unnecessarily. You want to make sure that you can have that confidence going in, that that's why you felt that way and not because you were struggling. We would rather you test later and do really well than to test earlier and have a score that is not representative of the work that you've put into it. So we want you to succeed, which is why we put so much effort into a podcast on test day, which can seem like something that gets left for last minute, but can make or break an exam. It's something incredibly important, and we want you to succeed.